Okay, alrighty, and let's kick off. So kia ora everybody, and again, thanks Amanda for your introduction, and thank you for those who have decided to attend this particular session. So my story begins actually with an act of literary vandalism, and the purpose of which, and maybe some justification for it, is to provide us with an example of one of the key difficulties facing any institution when we attempt to digitize an object that's associated with faith or religious devotion. The vandalism I'm talking about consists of taking a page or fragment from a book or manuscript, removing it from its original context, and transforming it beyond the meaning of those that it was intended to by its original creators. I'm going to discuss the role of digitization and the transformation of a fragment of text, once part of a personal talisman, into a two-dimensional flat object which is available to everybody. I hope to highlight the role of the curator or archivist in this transformation towards the end of my talk. And I want to ask us to consider our obligations not only to our audiences and our researchers and our users, but also to the objects in themselves. Why the original act of vandalism that I'm talking about occurred historically, I'd like us to be mindful, or I'd like to be mindful, that I'm not perpetrating further acts against these objects, even in a digital space. In 2020, I began working on a collection of medieval manuscript fragments. They were gifted to us by the university professor Frank R. Holbrecht, Department of Art History, University of Wisconsin-Madison. They were given to the university in about 2008, so they really sat in our collections, accessioned but not processed, and we hadn't done any work on them. So when I took on this role, I was really interested in the fragments, so I wanted to actually spend some time working on them myself. So the paper that I'm presenting actually focused on two of the items of this collection. The first is a single fragment on vellum, illustrated with a capital initial. And the second is a single page, from a late 15th century book of hours. And you see, when the collection came into the university itself, when the professor gifted them, they came in actually complete with the dealer's wallets that were probably how they were probably purchased. So they had the prices on them. They had a few dealer's notes written on the back. So he hadn't really done much with them himself. Holbrecht was actually an art history professor. But he just had a particular interest in medieval manuscripts. So during the course of my talk, what I'd like us to do is really think about three challenges that I want to present. The first challenge is, what is the nature of an object in an archival collection, or a museum, or a library for that matter? In particular, an object created solely for the purpose of public or religious devotion. Remember, these artifacts, our medieval manuscript fragments, are not just ordinary works on a page, but for the faithful, they're sacred words handed down during an act of divine revelation. I want to talk about this a little bit more as we go along through my presentation. The second challenge considers the questions of transformation. What transformation does an object undergo when it's removed from its original context, placed into a collection of unrelated objects in an archive or museum? My question is it still an object of devotion? And further, does creating a digital copy of the object transform it yet again? Especially if in creating these objects, we are potentially creating something divine. And that's something I want us to consider. The last thing I want us to think about is, what role does the curator or archivist play in leading this transformation? How do we, as custodians of these objects, balance our obligations to those whom these objects still hold spiritual resonance with the needs of those wishing to access them purely for research or historical purposes? But before we can answer these questions, we need to really understand more about ourselves as well as our users, because we're the people who are ultimately working with these objects. We're the people who describe them, interpret them, and display them in our exhibitions. I want to talk a little bit about material culture. So material culture is concerned with social relationships, and we're relationships of things with the people. We know a lot about how medieval manuscripts are created. But what I would like to look at, and what I would like to discuss in some detail, is how these objects create or make people. This issue is especially important when we're working with objects deeply connected with the Creator's worldview. That is, their understanding of the relationship between the sacred world and the profane world, and importantly, the objects and rituals that can mediate between the two. Now, even though I'm presenting this talk primarily from looking at Christian perspectives, Christian theology, it also applies equally to other objects, other sacred objects. For us, for example, when we're dealing with Māori and Pacifica objects, and we talk about these objects being imbued with muri or life force. So these are our taonga. And the same thing applies to objects that were created for any other religious faith. Christianity is interesting because almost from its beginning, it's a religion that's been orientated always towards objects. And it was accepted that objects can mediate a dialogue between humans and the divine. One of the more intricate objects, and one of my favorite objects in this collection, is a fragment from an illuminated initial. Clearly, this has been cut at some point from its original text. For us as interpreters, understanding a single letter fragment presents a particular set of problems. How do I interpret a single letter? What do I say about a single letter? The only information we were provided with was what was written on the wallet that it came with. Therefore, as part of processing the collection, I undertook high resolution digital scans. I then sent these scans to a number of researchers, both within New Zealand, with within our own institution here at the university, and also internationally. Because what I wanted to do was learn a little bit more about them, about their context, what they were about. One of the people I actually sent these images to was a manuscript expert, Christa Hemmel. Now, some of you may be familiar with his writing, with his books around medieval manuscripts. And we actually got to meet him a couple of months ago when he was visiting Auckland. He suggested that that my letter, my capital N, was possibly from Venice, because it was similar style and form to one of the many scattered initials from what was known as the Master of Murano Gradual in Venice circa 1420. Now, the gradual takes its name from the place where it was created. The gradual itself was disbound at some point in the past and now exists only in a series of cuttings and in several leaves and several collections. It's also widely available and scanned on the internet. And I found numerous references referring to the Murano gradual, and it's very similar in shape or form to our original initial, as you can see. But looking at the use and reception of these fragments, we know that even in the 15th century, illuminated capitals were being cut out of these manuscripts and kept as personal talismans. They were keepsakes in order to ward off temptations of Satan and to protect them from creating sin for sin itself. Now, it's difficult to tell whether our particular letter was, or when that particular letter was cropped, unfortunately. But what we do know is that a close crop following the contours of the actual letter itself suggests an earlier distribution, and broader crops which show more of the surrounding parchment and matrix and more of that surrounding page suggests a later distribution. It's pretty difficult when I was reading this to really tell, whether this was an earlier or later distribution, but judging by the comparisons with others of a similar thing, it's possible that could have been cut out of his original text more historically than it was by a dealer who removed it later. Now, digitization of this object has helped us access, study, and interpret the fragment in lots of different ways. We can help look at its production, its materiality, its physicality. Studying the digital object in detail can give us clues about its maker, the time and place in which it was made. The nature of the scribe's calligraphy, for instance, can reveal something about how and where a person was trained and when he was working. The quality of workmanship can point to circumstances around its creation and specifically who it was intended for. Our digital object has opened up a whole new world of non-invasive examination for us. We've also been able to use it in online, our Zoom teaching sessions. So with the aid of the Zoom tool, we can view a lot more detail of the parchment that's not visible even with someone using in the reading room, looking at the original with a fine magnifying glass. For our experts studying this digital object, it certainly helped us in its identification. The study of the manuscript in a digital space is now common form. In fact, many researchers actually studying the digital versions of manuscripts only. They may never actually see the physical item. But there are numerous elements of the manuscript we can investigate by studying its digital form. Yet, as de Hemel argues, we still remain focused and we're stuck on looking at the digital image on a flat screen. We get little sense of the object's size, its weight, its fleshiness, or even any of the smell of the object itself. And these are one of the reasons why we actually encourage people to actually come and view these items themselves, to actually get a feel of its physicality. Now, the problem with medieval manuscripts is that they often are shut away in libraries and institutions across the globe. So it can actually be quite difficult to actually come and see the physical thing itself. So it makes sense that researchers are actually studying the digital rather than the physical. What's important for us to remember, and this is de Hemel himself, when I asked him about what he thought about digital copies when I saw him in August, he said the problem is you can't get a sense of the divine from the digital image, no sense of its magic that's imbued in the original object during the act of its creation. I'm not sure I actually agree with this, because for some, I know that the digital representation can be just as powerful as its fleshy counterpart. Scholar Richard Davis suggests that objects have life stories just as many people do. Many objects are born, they live their lives without leaving their own villages. But some objects experience lives of travel, change, transformation, and even celebrity. And it's the biographies of these objects that make the most for interesting stories. During our object-based lesson teaching that we do, we often talk about object biographies as being just as key to the actual content of the object in its own right. So what I want to do now is move on and actually talk about one of the objects in this collection and perhaps learn a little bit more about its particular biography. So this example comes from a French book of hours. And again, according to our dealer's notes, this most likely comes from the 15th century, later half of the 15th century. Now, our own scholar of religion here at the University of Auckland had a look at the digital images that I was able to send him, and Nicholas Thompson was the name. And he was about to identify us the Latin text as Psalm 51, verses 11 to 19. And this is a text that Allegri sent to his famous Miserere me Domini, God have mercy on me. You can see from the actual pages itself that it was heavily annotated in the margins. So sending digital copies to pages to one of our own medieval French scholars, including Veronique, who I didn't see is on today, but I know she's an active member of BSANZ. So she was able to translate some of the text for us. So they start from around 1733. The marginalia suggests that the book was in the hands of a single family for several decades. They were using the pages of this particular fragment to record the deaths and prayers of many family members. We know that Psalm 51 is one of the 7 penitential psalms, which features in the Office of the Dead. So it actually makes sense that the owner of the manuscripts chose these specific pages to record the deaths of those around them. I was actually able to chase up some of these families, some of the generations of these families on ancestry.com, by the way. But unlike graduals and other liturgical texts, Book of Hours were produced for wealthy middle classes. They were often individualized and included the names of family members. They even had their portraits included in the actual illustrations and illuminations. They were books of personal devotion rather than texts for public worship. And they were developed for lay people who wished to incorporate elements of monasticism into their devotional life, into their prayer life, into their own spirituality. So these were personal items of worship for people. So what we have here is a page of a book created to assist in someone's spiritual life. But it's also a journal that they use to account and record those who are past, but also to offer personal messages and prayers for mercy in the afterlife. The single page provides us with a real source of meaning about the tradition in which it stems and the owner's intent and use of this fragment. But how much meaning can be drawn from a single object and its description alone? That's a different matter altogether. The final part of my talk, what I'd like to look at, is the ways in which curators address items of faith, recognizing the difference between practice and the examination and description of faith is often different. We may seem, as curators, it might seem easy for us to draw lines between the two, but I argue that actually not quite that straightforward, and it's something that we always need to be mindful of when we're working with these kinds of objects. So Kerry Thomas asked this pivotal question. She says, if a manuscript was created to spread the word of God and protect those from the evil, those owners and the creators of these manuscripts from the evils of sin, what happens when they're replicated in a digital space? For us, what happens when we're actually scanning these digital items of worship? Are we recreating that? She argues that the digital surrogate, I mean, I use these terms all the time. We call them digital surrogates, we call them digital copies, call them facsimiles, but I want us to consider whether or not they're actually something else. Thomas actually says that that using these kind of terms is a misnomer. She suggests for some that they're just simply the latest manifestation of the medieval scribe or Christian theologian's ideas about bodily resurrection and the ongoing power of holy relics. The manuscript is not simply transformed into zeros and ones to be lost in the vastness and emptiness of cyberspace, but it's actually something recreated, allowing us the means of achieving the same spiritual kind of salvation as those original scribes were aiming for. Just as Elon Musk wishes to have his mind resurrected into the digital realm upon his demise, so the digitized manuscript becomes resurrected to live on in a digital world. If the physical object can be a port to come out of Harry Potter, if the physical object can be a port key to the sacred, why can't the port key just as easily be a touchpad, a tablet, or a computer screen? If this is digital resurrection, as Kerry Thomas argues, what happens to the original object if it gets left behind? In his work, Your Digital Afterlives, Eric Steinhardt argues that uploading your mind to the digital domain doesn't leave the flesh behind, it merely intensifies it. Perhaps the same can be said for a digital manuscript. It can certainly turn a previously broken up or scattered manuscript into a whole one again. As we've seen, there are many institutions now that are recreating entire digital manuscripts in a digital way and placing them online, even though the physical objects, the physical manuscript, the pages can either be lost or they can be scattered internationally in private collections and private homes or in museums and institutions such as our own. As curators and archivists and collection managers, we make new meanings from objects coming into our institutions all the time. Yet we have a degree of control over how they are understood by our users through the way we describe them, through the interpretations that we do, and the way that we use them for our exhibitions. Yet even in our own archive, manuscripts acquire new meanings and new values. And unfortunately, these can completely overshadow their existing values or their previous ones or their original ones. This effect can be particularly intense because of the contrast between the new value as an object of history or art or of research and its previous meaning as a symbol or a taonga or treasure. As archivists, the ways in which we describe objects usually falls into one or a combination of broad categories. We can simply describe a medieval manuscript fragment as an example of the scribe's art and talent. We can describe it as an example of early book production. We can talk about it as medieval, as the medieval scribe or devotion, an example of religious devotion, or simply just an example of medieval history. The issue is that its original meaning, however, may never completely be obscured, and there might be those, as Thomas argues, that want to see the original item restored in part or in whole up to its former value, and that's as a spiritual taonga. Despite our best efforts and our description of these objects, at the end of the day, the meaning of any object depends on how it's understood or interpreted by our users, whether that's in a digital space or a physical space. What we can do as curators and as collection managers and as archivists, however, is guide the thinking and how we describe and interpret these particular objects. For example, we can be mindful of our own faith traditions or secular worldviews and how these can influence or describe the way we deal with objects of faith. coming from a museum background, working a lot with ritual objects, museums generally, they don't like talking about contemporary faith practice. They often refer to it as something in the past, as an object and an object's previous history rather than its present history. We often it's easier to remove them and just refer to them as a physical object or an object of history, or describe it in a less personal way as an object of faith from a different era. We can be mindful of the whole item's biography as in the way we describe it, helping to create meaning greater than the sum of its individual elements. So for our manuscripts, for example, it's not just vellum, it's not just pigment, it's not just an example of the scribe's art or a particular text from a particular religious text. And lastly, we consider how digitization of a religious object activates a new form of presence and meaning that can echo and extend the way it was originally received and transmitted, and a way which we've appropriated it. And I guess importantly, we consider the mana of these objects, or the muri, or the life force, or the spirit of the objects themselves, perhaps before we reduce them to minor amusements. Such as I found on a website when I was preparing for this talk. There's a group that actually animates these manuscript pages, and while initially it's quite amusing, but when you think about the nature of the object itself, the meaning of the object for people who it holds resonance for, yeah, I wonder if this is the right thing that we should be doing. And that's it.